I was away. I was on holidays last week, and so we had Lori Hudson here, and I've heard good things. Bit of a break from our look at the life of King David, but I want to take a slightly different tack, kind of circling back theme-wise today, but I'm going to get this guy to step back just a little. I want you to imagine with me, if you can. Imagine living in a country. You're in a country. Imagine this nation, this kingdom, this country founded on the rule of God and his anointed one. The very laws of the land are based on God's word. The culture is built around honoring God and his word. Then imagine that over time, things shift a little bit, and there's a group of people who begin to feel that maybe getting their own way really is more important than honoring God's anointed one. And imagine that this group, they're small at first, but it quietly spreads until at one point it comes to represent really the hearts and minds of the people of the nation. What they declare they are and what they are in their hearts are two different things. Imagine the anxiety and the stress that God's people, those who are still faithful to God, still faithful to his anointed one, imagine the stress they felt as they saw hints and heard whispers of these changes happening in their country. What's going on? What can we do? It wasn't like this. Imagine their fear and panic when at last the masks come off and the leader of this group is declared king. Imagine the weeping of God's people as they saw the Lord's anointed driven from his throne and his loyal servants are suddenly fugitives. What would become of God's people in such a nation? What would become of those who don't bow their knee to the new regime? Where was God while all of this was unfolding? What should God's people have done? How should God's people respond? Now, I know that's a far-fetched and unrealistic scenario. I appreciate you humoring me by imagining along with me, right? That would be crazy. That's nothing like anything we've seen. But this is exactly the situation in the kingdom of Israel that we have been reading about as we've been reading through the life and reign of King David. As I said, we had a break last week. The week before, we were looking at 2 Samuel 16, 2 Samuel 15. This week, I want to take a slight detour and look at Psalm 3. We read in 2 Samuel 15, verses 30 and 31, that as David and his followers were fleeing Jerusalem, he ascended the Mount of Olives. So he crossed the Kidron Valley and had to get over this hill, ascended the Mount of Olives barefoot and with his head covered, and he was weeping as he went, and he was praying to God about his troubles. And this psalm comes out of somewhere in that time, the superscript, or the superscription, I guess it's before verse 1 of this psalm. It says it's a psalm of David when he fled from Absalom, his son. This is one of the handful of psalms that we have that are directly linked to a certain time and circumstance. And since we've been reading through this, I thought this is a great kind of inside look. What was David thinking and feeling? How was he responding? We get a lot of these details in the narrative in 2 Samuel, but I want us to take a look at this psalm. It's short, it's 8 verses. And I think it makes a very, very clear point. And it's mentioned in the final verse, but I really think it's the big main theme, big idea, and that is that salvation, that deliverance, salvation comes from the Lord. That is the only place it comes from. There are many other people and things and methods, ways of thinking that advertise themselves as the thing that can save, as the thing that can solve the problems, as the thing that can deliver us. David is no stranger to these things. Salvation, though, belongs to the Lord. So because this is a psalm, and psalms are essentially songs or poems, studying them is a little bit different. I love this book, but it's different to preach from because, like, if anyone has studied poetry in school, you know, you were an English literature major, no shame in that, but I don't know what you're doing for work. You know that a poem is kind of a thing. It's like a painting. It is a piece of art, and you experience it in its whole. But if you want to try and explain it, and there's pieces and there's nuances, doing so can help bring it to light, but you also risk breaking it by taking it apart. I don't want to do that. So I'm going to read through it first. Then we're going to move through in some chunks here, and we'll see some things about it. So it says, a psalm of David when he fled from Absalom, his son. O Lord, how many are my foes? Many are rising against me. Many are saying of my soul, there is no salvation for him in God. But you, O Lord, are a shield about me, my glory and the lifter of my head. I cried aloud to the Lord, and he answered me from his holy hill. I lay down and slept. I woke again, for the Lord sustained me. I will not be afraid of many thousands of people who have set themselves against me all around. Arise, O Lord, save me, O my God, for you strike all my enemies on the cheek. You break the teeth of the wicked. Salvation belongs to the Lord. Your blessings be on your people. This is meant to be sung in a corporate worship kind of setting, and there's all these declarations in here, but since we're kind of coming at it from the context of the story of David and fleeing from Absalom, I think we can, it adds some color to it, some depth to it. So I want to look at it in a few different pieces, and there's a neat structure to it. There's a bit of that hourglass or chiasm structure to it, and some of you, like me, you're like, oh, that's so cool, and others are like, I don't get what the hourglass has to do with it. Can we just read it? Sure. But the first piece, verses 1 and 2, it starts off with David doing something important. He is telling God about his enemies. He's praying to God, and he opens it up by telling God not about the weather, not about, like there's no small talk. He gets right to it. Oh Lord, how many are my foes? Many are rising against me. Many are saying of my soul, there is no salvation for him in God. That key word, many, comes up time and again, and that's to show that this isn't like David's best buddy and him are having a disagreement, right? This isn't a fair fight. This is David being overwhelmed. He uses the singular for himself. Many have risen against me. It's just me, and there's all these people. Overwhelming odds. Now, David has faced numerous foes before. David is no stranger to dangerous situations and trouble, right? We know some facts from his life history. When he was just young, he worked as a shepherd for his father, and he reports that at different times he had not only faced, but actively fought physically lions and bears that would try to take the lambs from his flock, okay? And that's not like turn the dogs on them and get the 12 gauge. It's like, Dave, what did you do? Well, I ran at it and I had a stick. So I grabbed it by the hair and I beat it with the stick. And it dropped the sheep and it tried to bite me, so I beat it some more, and now my dad's got a rug, right? It's like, okay, a stick. Why didn't I think of that? This is how he, right? We know that a little bit later on, he faced a giant named Goliath, who wasn't just like a big dude, but he was a champion, which means that he was, he had a significant body count, right? He had a record. He won, and that means that his foes had died before him. This guy had been killing people since he was, I was going to say since he was small. I have no idea if this guy was ever small, right? A little bit like Theodore Cornelsen. That is a long baby. But David fought this guy. David, we know, fought the armies of the Philistines, and many times him or some of his mighty men were badly outnumbered, but he overcame. David fought against or escaped from the forces of King Saul. So David is no stranger to dangerous situations. It's not like, oh, Muffin, you've lived this coddled little life, and now suddenly you're finding that not everyone agrees with you. Oh, it's like, no. He knows what it is to fight uphill, okay? But this is a different situation. This situation has like an added venom in it that adds to the pain. It creates pain far greater than the circumstances themselves. It's like getting stung by a hornet. I got stung by a hornet last week. You can see it on my arm right there, right? The hole is tiny, but it's like that thing keeps stinging for minutes. It's like, really? Enough, I get it, right? This is kind of like that. It's like maybe David's been, I don't know if he's ever hit with an arrow before, but this one's got something on it. Why is that? Because the many enemies that are rising against David in this circumstance, these are not lions, these are not Philistines, these are his own people. This is his team. These are the people of God rising against him under the leadership of his own son. Like Absalom, who's leading this rebellion, is David's son. So this hurts. This has got a sting to it. There's a betrayal. And we see here David as he's lifting this situation to God and telling God, not informing him because God doesn't know, but he's declaring what's going on. He says there's many enemies, and specifically he says these enemies, they specifically condemn David before God. It's different than the Philistines, right? The Philistines would be like, your God can't save you because our God's stronger. Want to see why? Goliath, come on out here and show them how strong our God is. David's like, no, there's no contest there. But the people are saying, David, there's no salvation for your soul in God. God has rejected you. We read that even a couple of weeks ago in 2 Samuel 16. As David's leaving, we met this weaselly fellow named Shimei, who's like up on the hill cursing David. He's so mad, and he basically says, God has rejected you, David, because you're a man of bloodshed. You've played dirty, and God is paying you back. This is happening because of God. He's not going to save you. God is against you. The thing is, David himself, he doesn't totally disagree, right? He understands that the rebellious actions of Absalom and the people are one of the consequences of his own sin with Bathsheba when he sinned against God. And so there is an element of truth in what they're saying, which adds to the venom, right? It's one thing if someone just straight up makes up stuff about you. That's utterly, it's like, that's so untrue, it's ridiculous. But no, when they grab some truth and then just take it out of context and twist it, it's like, oh, that's dirty, right? We're really good at that. Now, they didn't have Photoshop and social media back then, but you know what the feeling is. And then, so you see that David is carrying this, and his first response to the situation is to pray. This is characteristic of David, right? He cries out to God, tells him about his situation, tells God about his enemies and what they're saying about him. This is called lament. This is a theme that shows up a lot in the Bible, and there are many psalms that reflect this, where David or whoever wrote the psalm, the people of God, cry out to God and tell him what's going on. It looks a lot like complaint. It is, in a sense, but there's ways that we do this, and you change it just a little bit and the whole thing goes sour. Lament like this is not angrily throwing the facts in God's face, right? Like an accusation. Look what's happening. You said you were good. You said you were going to protect me. Well, is this your idea of good, God? Like, this is, come on, man, right? Like, or you promised and I'm going to hold you to it. I've got your contract here. I'll see you in court. It's not that attitude. It's the cry of a small heart in the midst of large danger, crying out to the big God that he has come to trust. It's recognizing that my circumstances are too much for me, and rather than turning from God in shame, I ought to be big and strong enough and self-sufficient enough to do, it's like, no, I'm just going to cry out to God. God, I'm look what's going on. Not that you don't see, but God, I'm drowning, and I'm turning to you and declaring my trust in you. I think lament is as much for ourselves as it is for God. In David telling God these things, he's reminding himself of who he can turn to. But he doesn't just lament. The psalm doesn't just start with, hey God, FYI, everyone's on my back. It's looking pretty bad. Your friend Dave sent, right? That's not it. He moves on to this next very important section where, in addition to telling God about his enemies, he declares the truth about God And verse 3 is kind of like a contrast to this, right? He says, how many are my foes? They're saying of my soul, there's no salvation for him in God. Verse 3, but you, O Lord, are a shield about me, my glory and the lifter of my head. That contrast there, that but is so important because it's like David's saying, this is true, but this is also true. It's important to follow up lament with declarations of truth about God. You almost always see that in Scripture. And I think it's an important balance for us. But it's tough. It's tough partly because if you're honestly in a position to lament, you're facing difficult things, right? Everything's tough. But I think there's also this situation, how do I put it? It presents like a challenge to shallow theology. It's very common, but it's shallow in this sense. I keep losing my spot. Many people believe that pain and loss or disappointment or experiencing dangerous circumstances essentially proves that either God doesn't exist or he's not good. It's like their theology says God is good, God exists, God loves me, and then they draw this, therefore, everything should be sunshine and roses. Oh no, it's not sunshine and roses. What did I just step in? This isn't good. And then they go back and they go, oh, instead of questioning their logical leap, their assumptions, they question their initial premise. Maybe God isn't good. Maybe God isn't powerful. Maybe he doesn't even exist, because otherwise, why would I be facing these difficult things? For a person with that kind of belief system, their lament is essentially a declaration of non-faith. It would be like saying, I trusted in you, God, but many are my enemies rising up around me. So I guess you weren't as awesome as you said. I guess I'm on my own. And for a Christian who has some of this theology worked into their worldview, maybe unintentionally, maybe just how you were raised or whatever, that idea that a good God and evil circumstances are mutually incompatible, one temptation that we face is essentially to deny the evil of our circumstances, right? We're like, I want to believe in a good God. Good God should mean no bad circumstances. Here's what looks like bad circumstances, but if that's true, then God doesn't exist. I really need God to exist, so maybe this isn't as bad as it seems. Maybe it's all good. Maybe I'm just overreacting. Maybe my Christian responsibility, maybe acting in faith, is to essentially say, these aren't really problems. I'm not really experiencing pain. And there's some wisdom to a limited degree, right? We should have a positive attitude, look on the bright side, but we can carry this too far, right? And there are many well-intended Christians and Christian teachers that will say things like this, but I think they can easily go too far. And they'll say things like, oh, like what you're experiencing, that's just the devil trying to steal your joy. The devil wants to steal. But look, if your spouse is dying of cancer and you're heartbroken and you don't know what's going to happen to your world, that's not just the devil stealing your joy. That is a very painful life event crushing down on you. Continuing to feel sad and burdened in that is not, oh well, you're just putting your faith in the devil. If you had more faith, you would just seize your joy and not feel sad. That is not some of the Bible teaches. And the amount of painful mental gymnastics a person has to go through to sustain that is not God-honoring. And that is not a sustainable faith. You can maybe you can work that tension up for a while. It will eventually let go. And where does a person go from there? It's not just always the devil trying to steal your joy, or those are just lying symptoms from the enemy. You're not really sick. It's not really cancer. Your leg's not really broken. That's just the enemy. It's like, I'm sorry, if the bone is sticking out of my leg and bleeding on your carpet, that is an extremely effective illusion, right? Or maybe I just broke my leg or snapped my knee in half at a youth event, right, Em? Never be a youth leader. If I'm a youth pastor, you sign up, there's a waiver and everything. There were injuries. This is not what David's doing here. He isn't saying that because God is his shield and his glory, the painful betrayal and the imminent physical danger he's facing are not real or they're somehow canceled. He's not going, many are my foes, and they're saying all this. It looks really bad, but God's my shield, so it's all good in the hood. No, he says, Evil is evil and God is good. These both exist. Okay, so then what does he do? I mean, he's being very consistent with what the Bible teaches, right? The world is broken. People are sinful. But God is still present and he's still loving. Now, I get it. There's a mystery down at the depths of that becomes sometimes very difficult when we're facing painful circumstances. But David sets an example for us. He holds to both, right? The truth of who God is and David's relationship with him without denying the evil of his circumstances. Instead, he turns to prayer and faith, which we see in this central part in verses 4 and 5. He says, I cried aloud to the Lord, and he answered me from his holy hill. I lay down and slept. I woke again, for the Lord sustained me. This couplet, you could see the parallelism, right? I did this and God did this. I did this and God did this, and it's similar. It's so central to this psalm, and really, I think that is such a great summary of David's life of faith. It sums up how a mighty man of God, the Lord's anointed, this guy is a powerful warrior. He's got Goliath's sword hanging above his fireplace, okay? This guy has been there and done that. He's a mighty king. How does he face dangers and circumstances? Like this. It's kind of counterintuitive, right? We like to think of David, we almost picture like the Chuck Norris of the Bible, like this guy's unstoppable, except, and I think this passage, when we think about it, is shocking to us in what it does not say, right? This is perhaps the least macho, the least alpha male thing he could say, let alone do. It looks so unlike what most of the people we would admire do when they're facing circumstances, whether they're Christian or not. And it is generally, if we're honest, the opposite of our instinctive response to trouble. What does he do? He cried aloud to the Lord. This is perhaps the fundamental act of humility and faith. The word that's translated cried, that's an excellent translation of that word. And that denotes the tone. It isn't just saying he vocalized, right? He yelled, he said, he cried. It denotes the tone. It's not an angry yell. It's not a victorious shout. It's not just an indifferent mention. Oh, by the way, right? It doesn't matter to me, but it's none of those things. It is a loud and almost involuntary cry. It is what babies do. It's what people who are grievously injured or in great pain, and despite that, they cry out. This is not a strong act. This is a weak act. And he cried aloud. This is an observable conversation, not an encrypted text message. This is like a frightened child in a public place. The kid who skins their knee at the park or is afraid of something in the mall or whatever, and they just start to cry out. There's no concern over making a scene, only concern that the father hears and comes to the rescue. This is not dignified. It's one thing, well, he went home and he cried quietly. He cried aloud, and 2 Samuel backs this up. He was going up the hill, weeping out loud, takes his shoes off, he's got his head covered, all of these public displays of humility. He was far, far less concerned with his own dignity than most of us are. And when he's facing these circumstances, he cries aloud. And it says, he cried aloud to the Lord, and he answered me from his holy hill. David's cry wasn't just to anyone, it was intentionally directed to God. And David's faith told him that the Lord heard him, even though God was not visibly present with him. And David's faith told him that God heard and answered, even though David's circumstances had not yet visibly changed. I cried and you heard me. And then David lay down and slept. He rested, not merely out of exhaustion, but in trust, right? And there's a difference. I don't sleep well. Exhaustion will get it done. But that isn't what this is looking at. I'm sure he was exhausted, but how many of us, right? you're facing difficult circumstances and you would say, I've lost sleep over that. Or whether you say it or not, it's like you've lied awake at night, or you wake up in the middle of the night and you can't get back to sleep because your mind is going over stuff. Not because you're praying about them, although I know some of you do, and that's awesome. I wish that was my first gear. But because we're thinking, or we're scheming, or we're worrying, or we're plotting revenge, or we're crafting the response that we wish we could have said earlier in that would have put them in their place and showed everyone that and that's where our brain goes. David is saying the opposite. The picture here is not only of a fugitive choosing to sleep when maybe he should have kept running or he should be keeping watch. It's not just a bold move. Oh, look at him. He's so cocky. He's having a nap. It's like the tortoise and the hare, right? I'm so far ahead, I can just nap and it'll be fine. That's not what's going on. This is more like a picture of a child who, having cried out and then been comforted by his father about circumstances that were painful, frightening, and confusing, he still doesn't understand all of it, is now resting and sleeping out of simple trust. I can sleep because my father is awake. That's what he's doing. And that sounds like great theology, right? And we say that's the way we should do it, but Pastor, that's not very realistic. How does that work out? I don't know. Ask this guy who is literally fleeing for his life. Are your circumstances bad? How many people are armed and hunting you right now? This is pretty grim. This doesn't play out in the real world. It kind of does. But we have to choose to trust like that. This very counterintuitive, non-alpha male, weak-sounding response is applicable to God's people everywhere. This isn't just, that's what kings do. This is what God's people are called to do. When faced with many enemies who attack us with words or even with violence, we are to cry aloud to the Lord and then rest in trust that God hears us and will sustain us. That's scary, right? That's that step of trust that you're actually gonna, right? I believe that this safety harness will hold me. Look, it's got the certification on it. It's been inspected and everything. Okay, great. Step off the edge with just that holding you up. I'm totally convinced that this is safe. Okay, after you. I'm not one of those people that doesn't trust the experts, okay? This harness was clearly made by experts. Are you gonna step off and let it because if it breaks, you're gonna plummet to your death. But, right? And that's that moment, do you trust this or not? Oh, I better hold on still. And that's what we do, isn't it? I'm trusting God, but I'm gonna hold on just in case God isn't trustworthy. And that's understandable because we can't see him. It's also insane. Look, if it's God, who else? God might not have it, but I've got it. I'll use my hands. I'm that. Really? That's what we're going to trust in? But we do. David, though, and he didn't just come up with this in the moment, right? This is established by a pattern throughout his life. And now in crisis, he just does what he's trained himself to do. He trusts in God. But this is much easier said than done. So then we see some of the outworking of this. We see the faith and courage that this produces in Psalm chapter 3, verse 6. It says, I will not be afraid of many thousands of people who have set themselves against me all around. Okay, that's a choice. Personally, when I feel like many thousands of people have set themselves against me and I'm surrounded, which is not an entirely foreign feeling to Canadians in Canada in 2023, I can say I will not be afraid. I am honestly working on that being the truth. Fear's pretty natural, it's right there. When he's saying this, I don't think this is David just going, I'm going to choose this and I'm going to fake it till I make it, although there was probably some scary times. I think this verse is important in where it is in the psalm, because on one hand, this is the David we like, right? This is the guy we would like to emulate. He's brave and courageous in the face of overwhelming odds. He's a fearless warrior. And if you just took this verse out of context, you say, hey, there's this psalm that David wrote when he was being pursued by all the armies of Israel led by his rebellious son. And you know what he said? I will not be afraid of many thousands of people, even though they've set themselves against me all around. Because David was such a man's man. He was ready to take them all. Read it in context, though. That's not what he's saying. He's saying, in light of my trust in God, in light of the God who sustains me when I cry out to him, I won't be afraid. Literarily, this verse is strongly parallel to, hold on, I've lost my spot, to verse 3, sorry. Because this courage that he's talking about is a result of the humility and trust, not a contrast to it. Verse 3, he declares God is his shield, which is an image, it's imagery of protection. And he's the lifter of his head, which is like it's his source of hope and value. I can hold my head high. They're condemning me, but God lifts my head. And because of that, David can face his very real dangers with courage. So on the surface, this verse by itself looks very similar, right, to Rambo. It's just him versus everybody. The self-reliant, self-confident, boastful courage of the alpha male hero with greased muscles and a machine gun kind of thing. But it's entirely different. It's got an entirely different foundation. It's a much stronger foundation. Even the strongest guy is going to run out of his own resources. David isn't leaning on his, though. And then we come to this kind of the tail end, and then there's verse 8's the conclusion, but verse 7, where now he's telling his enemies the truth about God. He says, "Arise, O Lord, save me, O my God, for you strike all my enemies on the cheek. You break the teeth of the wicked." This verse is strongly parallel to verse 1 and 2, declaring how David trusts God to do the opposite of what his enemies have intended. And if you look, like there's a lot of the words that are parallel, and it's kind of one of the ways that Hebrew poetry exists. So we see that David in verse 7 says, "Arise, O Lord." In verse 1 he said, "Many are rising against me." It's the same verb. They're rising up, but I'm asking God to rise up. In verse 1 he says, "Many are saying of my soul." They're speaking condemning words. And then in verse 7, he says that God strikes them on the jaw or breaks the teeth of the wicked. And it's a mixed metaphor there. On one hand, breaking the teeth, it's like he's imagining his enemies like ferocious beasts. And their danger is in their bitey teeth. And it's like if you break their teeth, then they don't, right? But it's also this idea of being slapped or struck on the jaw. He's hitting their mouth. They're speaking these not true things. David, your God has turned your back against you. And David is saying, you make them eat their words. It's kind of how we might say that. You give them a knuckle sandwich and they eat their words. I'm working on translation. You'll see it'll be on Amazon. It's awesome. No, it's not. But that's kind of that picture. And then he says, right, "Save me, O God." And that is a direct affront to in verse 2 where they say there is no salvation for him in God. And David's like, "Save me. Show them that my salvation is in you." Like many other psalms, this one contains a prayer against the writer's enemies using violent imagery. I feel like we need to circle around that because there's a bunch of these, and I preached on this not long ago. I'm actually pulling a little bit from that other sermon, but just some things to keep in mind. And I know I'm almost out of time. Before you run away and go, "This is great. So anytime someone says something mean about me, I can pray that God will break their teeth." Fantastic. And then you read some other psalms and it's like, man, you can pray even worse things about your enemies, right? That their babies will be dashed against the rocks and all kinds of stuff. That's in the Bible. Like, it's not children's literature, but it's about children in a weird way. We're not supposed to just grab this and use it as weapons against our enemies. One of the things we have to keep in mind, our enemies are people that offend us, inconvenience us, compete with us for what we feel we need. God's enemies are people who have set themselves against God and his purposes. God deals with God's enemies on God's terms, but we don't get to say, like, "God, this guy said a mean thing about me, smite him with a mighty smite. You just wait till my dad gets here." Like, that's not what this is about. We don't get to walk around like the little big man and we're going to sick our God on people. That's not what the imprecatory psalms, that's what these are called, do. We're not cursing personal enemies. We're calling on God to curse his enemies. To our personal enemies, we as Christians are to respond the way Jesus and the Apostle Paul instruct. We don't curse, we don't retaliate, we bless them. We pray for our enemies, we forgive them as often as needed, and we implore them to be reconciled to God. That is acting out that trust, right? I don't need to defend myself against my enemies. I'm going to trust God. That's our response. And we're to lift our feelings, our anger, our pain, our frustration to God in prayer like David did. And then we trust God to judge rightly in his way and his time. So in this context, David is declaring his unshakable trust that God will certainly deal with the wicked people who are pursuing him according to God's wisdom and in God's timing. And it's maintaining, right? This is part of it. He's maintaining that the evil is real. It's not just an illusion. It's not just his opinion. It's not one of these sort of enlightened pseudo kind of Hindu ideas where it's like, well, even bad things are good if you look at it in the right way. All this good and bad is an illusion. It's all kind of the same. He's like, no. Evil is straight up evil, and God is good, and he's going to deal with it. He's not denying the evil in order to protect God's reputation. He's trusting in God. God, because he's holy and faithful, can be trusted to deal with it. Then he concludes the psalm with verse 8, and I'm going to conclude the sermon. Yes, timer, I see it. It's blinking at me. He writes, salvation belongs to the Lord, and blessing be on your people. Salvation belongs to the Lord. It is his property. It's his prerogative. It's the thing that he has and that he can bring about. It's not salvation belongs to the Lord, and I have some too, actually. You can buy it from him or me. You can go to him, or you can build it yourself with this kit that you can assemble at home. Salvation is the kind of thing, being saved, being delivered, ultimately, that's in God's hands. So David doesn't need to shoulder the ultimate responsibility for his vindication or his deliverance. This is a huge declaration of trust. Our instincts are like, that's an abdication of your responsibilities. That's you shirking. You just don't want to step up and do what needs to be done. I think he's doing what needs to be done. But he recognizes that even if he's like the best king and best guy, ultimately he cannot secure salvation for him or anyone. It's in God's hands. To think otherwise is an illusion. And also, the salvation isn't just about David himself. And this is a huge indicator of humility. So saying salvation belongs to the Lord is an indication of trust. Saying blessing be on your people, plural, brings this humility to it. The Lord will bless his people, not only David, as the Lord's anointed, but all of his people. David's understanding of who he was in relationship to the Lord kept him from seeing this very personal betrayal, right? It's like, hello, this is personal. It's my son rising up against me. I think this is personal. But he keeps it from seeing it just as this, I need to be vindicated, I need to get vengeance, you need to defend my reputation, God. He sees that it's God's throne, it's God's people, God is going to bless his people. So it's not merely trust that God would merely restore David's position and reputation. Although it seems that David is trusting in that, but we also see other places, like in, I think, 2 Samuel 15, David has stated that God in his wisdom might decide not to restore the throne to David. Maybe David will ultimately be a fugitive or be killed in that. You know what? God is still going to bless his people. God is still being faithful to his promises to me. He's going to work it out. It doesn't hang even on David getting what he not only wants, but feels like it's right for him to have. It's a trust in God that even if he doesn't get what he wants, God is going to bless his people. This blessing extends to us as well. As God's people, we're not living in David's Israel, but we are God's people. We are brought near through Jesus, the anointed son of David, whose life has a lot of parallels to this psalm. And I'm hesitant to do this because this is not, I think, the correct way to read the Bible. But man, there's a lot of parallels. Right? Jesus, for our sake, faced betrayal from his own people, and he was considered accursed by God. They were accusing him of being an enemy of God. He too cried aloud to the Lord, "Why have you forsaken me?" And he lay down and slept, in death, dying for us. But he also woke again because the Lord sustained him and accepted his sacrifice on our behalf. And because of that, we too can face our enemies without fear and without the need to take our vindication into our own hands. Salvation belongs to the Lord, and he will save his people. We're going to take communion this morning, and I'll ask the guys who, I think Mike talked to a team. If you're ready, you can just come to the front, and the team's going to make their way up. As we celebrate the Lord's Supper today together, I want to encourage you to reflect on this truth we've been talking about. We do have enemies all around us, certainly, but our worst enemy is within us. Just like David in the nation of Israel, there were Philistines, there were all kinds of people that would love nothing more than to catch David napping. But his biggest enemy came from within, and it's the same with us. Our own sin and brokenness, the selfishness and wickedness in all of our own hearts. And we can deny these things, right? That isn't really a solution. Eventually we must face the facts, even though they're terrifying. We are surrounded by evil inside and out. And we could try to hide, right? We can hide from people, hide from society, hide from ourselves, but that will never bring rest, because wherever we hide, we bring our own evil heart with us, ready to betray us. Or we can try to fight. That's often our instinct, depending on our wiring, right? We see many in our society. We can try to fight. We can take up the weapons of our enemies and fight them on their terms, right? We'll shout louder. We'll try to amass more lawyers and guns and money. And we'll fight back, alpha male style, using verbal and social and even physical violence, convinced that whatever we do is justified because we're God's people. He's on our side, right? The ends justify the means if you're a Christian, don't they? David sets a different example. So did Jesus. When the Lord's anointed faced betrayal and growing threats from powerful enemies, neither David nor Jesus denied the situation. They cried out to the Lord instead. They told him about it. They lamented. And then they reminded themselves of their position in relationship to God. They cried out in prayer, and then they rested in trust. The Lord will sustain me. The Lord will set things right. The Lord will deal with his enemies and with his children. These things are either true or they're not. David, Jesus, lived and died as though these things were factually true. I endeavor to do the same. I encourage you to do the same and to think about these things as we approach the Lord's table. The Lord's Supper it's a reminder that Jesus came and suffered and died to deal with our greatest enemy, that sin within ourselves, in our hearts. And in his death on the cross, he took all of that on himself. And our sin was crucified with him and buried with him. He defeated an enemy that we can't even see clearly. It's always right behind us. Like Kyla. Gotta walk. No, stay on it. So by taking this bread and this cup, right, we're remembering some things. There's a humility and trust in this. This isn't like a victory meal. Ha-ha! I'm eating the spoils from my defeated enemy. I'm eating their food in their... No. This is a reminder that we could not win this victory on our own. God won it for us. By taking this bread and cup, we declare that the Lord has done it. We can trust him and rest in the salvation that he's won for us. So do you do that? Do you trust him? Or are you resting in him? Or are you still kind of thinking that you've got to make it happen on your own? If you are trusting in him, I invite you to take communion with us this morning. The team's going to play while we hand out the bread. And once you get that, then we'll hand out the cup without pausing. And then once we all have both elements, I'll read the passage and we'll take them together.